a name showing perhaps the fact that they were a mixture of many tribes. They disappeared as a nation quite early in the conflict with the Franks, but curiously enough gave to the inhabitants of Gaul the name by which to this day the French call all Germans, Allemands. East of the Alemanni were remnants of the peoples which had fought against Marcus Aurelius, the Marcomanni and Quadi, of whom as a nucleus the great nation of the Bavarians was to grow. Following the Danube line still to the eastward we find the West Goths, Visigoths, and beyond them again to the northeast their brethren, the East Goths, Ostrogoths, stretching out into the Valley of the Don. These Goths, especially the western branch, had for a century been the most dangerous enemies of Rome. They had made numerous expeditions, both by land and sea, against the eastern Roman provinces, and had brought the government to such a pass that the Emperor Aurelian had been glad to buy them off from further ravages by giving up to them the great province of Dacia, north of the Danube. The Goths had already made a long and difficult journey on the way to Rome. We first hear of them perhaps 3 centuries before near the mouth of the Vistula, and now we find them near the mouth of the Danube. Of the journey we know little. They themselves believed that they had once come over from Sweden in 3 ships. The West Goths first, the East Goths next, and some time after the Gepidae, tardy ones, a close related tribe. The story is not incredible if we are willing to multiply the ships a little, and if we remember that to get to Scandinavia they must have made the same long journey to the northwest, which all their Germanic brethren had made. At all events, we may believe that the whole nation had moved, perhaps driven by enemies, perhaps in search of new pasture lands for their cattle, up the valley of the northward flowing, and down the valleys of the southward flowing rivers until they came near the Black Sea, and had then spread out westward until they reached the positions we have just described. It is hard for us, accustomed to permanent ways of living, to imagine what such a great migration was like. But it must be remembered that these people had no property but such as they could drive before them or carry upon their rude wagons. Their home was the forest and the plain. The river valley was their highway and their guide. Their progress from the Baltic to the Euxine was probably very slow. Perhaps not oftener than once in the life of each man would the nation leave its hunting grounds for new ones. Later we shall see them moving much more rapidly. For about a century after the Emperor Aurelian had given the province of Dacia to the West Goths, they had lived on comparatively good terms with their Roman neighbors and had come to lead more settled lives. But now, about the year 375, a new difficulty arose. A new people, as yet unknown in Europe, suddenly forced the Goths to come into closer contact with Rome. The Huns were a people surely not of German stock, nor even of the Aryan race. For want of a better term, we will call them Turanians. They came from the north of Asia, beyond the Great Wall of China, passed through the gateway of the nations between the Caspian Sea and the Ural Mountains, and fell upon the distant settlements of the East Goths. They were frightful little men living almost wholly on horseback, sweeping over the country like a whirlwind and leaving only destruction behind them. They had the olive skins of the Orientals, and their hair was worn long and tied into a knot behind. Their noses were so much turned up that the frightened Romans fancied they had nothing but 2 holes in the middle of their faces. They seemed hardly to deserve the name of human beings. Nothing could resist them. The East Goths surrendered and were forced to join the Huns in their attack upon the West Goths. These latter, in their despair, begged the Roman Emperor Valens to give them shelter, and were allowed to come over and settle in Moesia. It was understood that the Romans should furnish them with weapons and supplies, for which they should pay by defending the river against any new attack. The West Goths seem to have kept their part of the agreement, but the Roman officers were careless in their treatment of the barbarians. One trouble led to another until finally the Germans broke out into open revolt. The Emperor Valens, without waiting for any help from the West, gave battle near Adrianople in Thrace and was utterly defeated. He himself was killed in the retreat, and the Visigoths found themselves suddenly within the empire, with no army to oppose them, and, as it seemed, the promise of endless plunder. The Battle of Adrianople was one of the decisive battles of the world. The Battle of Adrianople was one of the decisive battles of the world. It taught the Germans that they could beat the legions in open fight, and that henceforth it was for them to name the price of peace. It broke once for all the Rhine-Danube. It broke once for all the Rhine-Danube frontier. Swarms of fighting men, Ostrogoths as well as Visigoths, came pouring into the empire. At the death of Valens, who had been the ruler of the East, his nephew Gratian was left as ruler of the West. He had sense enough to see that he could not hope to govern the whole of the vast Roman Empire, and called upon Theodosius, a Spaniard and a man of well-proved ability, to take the government of the East. The political genius of Theodosius saved the empire from ruin. He saw that it was hopeless to think of driving out the Germans, and that the best way to manage them was to keep them quarreling with each other. He made treaties by which the Visigoths were given lands in Thrace and the Ostrogoths in Pannonia, between the Mur and the Danube. They were to receive regular pay in money and were to defend the frontier. Their vanity was tickled with the fine-sounding name of allies, federati, and their leaders were placed in the highest positions in the state. The confidential minister of Theodosius was a German, a Vandal named Stilicho, son of a chieftain, who had served with his chestnut-haired squadrons in the armies of Valens. But the Gothic warriors were not long to be bound with paper chains. There were always some among them who despised the service of Rome and longed to be masters instead of servants. This restless ambition for conquest brought to the front the greatest leader of the Visigothic name, the famous Alaric. With him at its head, the nation took up its march once more. With the fixed purpose of finding lands in the very heart of the empire where they might settle once for all. Their taste of Roman ways seems only to have made them want more, and they were already losing something of the wildness they had brought from their northern home. The great Theodosius died just as Alaric was chosen leader of the West Goths. His empire was divided between his two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west, and was never again to be effectively united under one ruler. The sons were a wretched pair. With ruin staring him in the face, Honorius shut himself up in Ravenna and left the defense of the empire to Stilicho. Alaric at first fixed his attention upon Greece and moved his army southward into the center of the Peloponnesus. Arcadius, the eastern emperor, had no force sufficient to resist the assault, and Greece was only saved by a brilliant exploit of Stilicho, who crossed the Adriatic Sea and shut Alaric up within the province of Arcadia. He dared not risk a battle, however, and was glad to purchase the retreat of Alaric by a renewed commission as defender of Illyria. Nothing could have been better for Alaric. He gave up Greece only to be quartered in a rich and defenseless province close upon the borders of Italy. Every step of the Visigothic conquerors shows them to be emerging more and more from the condition of mere fighters and becoming, in a truer sense of the word, a nation. Their new quarters sufficed them for only about 3 years. Again, the nation in arms moved westward into the rich valley of the Po. The empire was now fully alarmed. From all the most distant frontiers, the legions were summoned in hot haste to Rome and formed by Stilicho into a great army with which he waited for Alaric near Pollentia, on the river Tanarus. A terrific battle was fought here in which Alaric was, if not badly beaten, at least turned back in his career. He was driven out of Italy and sought shelter in Pannonia. The government actually believed that the barbarians were disposed of forever. It had no conception of the masses of men waiting for the opportunity to pour through the breach of the defenseless frontier. Honorius kept on amusing himself at Ravenna. Until now he had shown for Stilicho the respect and confidence due to the savior of Rome. Stilicho had married the niece and adopted daughter of Theodosius, and had given his own 2 daughters successively in marriage to Honorius. It seemed as if his fortunes were bound up with the very life of the imperial family. But now, at the very moment when the only man who could hold a Roman army against the barbarians was more needed than ever, the mad folly which was destroying the empire more surely than her outward enemies, drove Honorius to cause the murder of his faithful servant. Some jealous rival had made him believe that so much power was dangerous to his tottering throne. Alaric, away up in Illyria, knew better how to value the only man who had ever defeated him. The death of Stilicho was the signal for a new invasion. The Gothic leader, Christian though he was, believed himself to be in the hands of destiny. A voice, it was said, had come to him out of a sacred grove, saying, "Penetrabis ad urbem," you will reach the city. And he knew that the city could be none other than Rome. The Goths, strengthened by their 6 years of rest, swept rapidly southward past Ravenna, where Honorius still kept his useless self, marched straight to Rome and began a regular siege. It was the first time for 800 years that Rome had seen a foreign enemy before her walls. The citizens could not yet believe that the whole city was in danger. Not until hunger and pestilence began to do their awful work did they send to ask terms of Alaric. "Give me all your gold, all your silver, all your movable property, and all your barbarian slaves, or the siege goes on. What then will you leave us? Your lives?" But perhaps Alaric was only in a sort of grim humor, making fun of the half-starved ambassadors. He finally agreed to accept a fixed sum in gold, silver, silken tunics, scarlet hides, and pepper, together with ample lands in the north of Italy. The mad young emperor at Ravenna, putting on a show of courage when it was too late, refused to agree to these terms. Alaric promptly renewed the siege, but this time in quite a different fashion. It is as if a strange awe at the name of Rome held him back from actual violence. He was in constant negotiation with the citizens, and even went so far as to set up and maintain for a few months a rival emperor. He now proposed still more moderate terms, which Honorius again refused, and the third assault on Rome began. A vigorous attack made a breach in the walls, and the city was in the hands of the enemy. It is curious to see how in the course of his long negotiations with the Romans, Alaric had come to be half a Roman himself. He is no longer the mere barbarian chieftain, eager only for a fight and careless of the future. He is the conqueror of Rome, and feels himself somehow to be thus a part of the wonderful civilization he sees about him. He commands his followers to respect the churches and their property. We have no reason to believe that the buildings of the city suffered very greatly. What the Germans wanted was movable plunder, and, laden with this, they set out for the south of Italy. Rome, after all these months of famine and pestilence, was anything but an agreeable residence. Besides, the Germans had not yet learned to live in cities. Their object, as shown by the frequent treaties, was to secure a permanent home when they should find a country suited to their mind. The later historian of their race says that Alaric meant to conquer Sicily and sail over to Africa. Certainly he gathered ships at Rhegium and is said to have been prevented only by a storm from crossing to Messina. Before he could renew his preparations, he died suddenly, the first great barbarian victim to the deadly climate of Italy, which was to be her best defense against the northern invader. The Visigoths forced their Roman captives to turn the channel of the river Bucentum, dug their leader's grave in the dry bed of the stream, let the waters flow back, and murdered all who had done the work, that the burial place of Alaric might forever remain a mystery. The capture of Rome made a deep impression upon the men of that day. They had been so accustomed to think of it as a sacred place that the fall of the city seemed to them like the end of the world. Some, either honest pagans or lukewarm Christians, said that it was because the ancient gods had been dishonored and were thus revenging themselves. It was in answer to such people that the great Saint Augustine, Bishop of Hippo in Africa, wrote his famous book, The City of God, in which he tried to prove that the great calamity was not due to Christianity, but that being only a city of this world, Rome must fall, while the true city of God should abide forever. How much the Emperor Honorius cared for Rome we may judge from a story which, whether true or not, shows what was thought of him at the time. An officer rushed into his presence and told him that Rome had perished. "What?" cried the emperor. "She was feeding from my hand an hour ago." He was much relieved when told that it was not his favorite hen, Roma, but only the capital of his empire that had perished. Alaric is to be remembered as the man who pointed out the way which so many others of his race were to follow. He was a great military genius whose equal was not found among the many leaders who built upon his plans. We may believe that. Upon this last expedition, the great bulk of the property of the Visigoths had been left behind with the women and children somewhere in the Alpine country, and it may have been this which led them now to give up the African plan and, under the lead of Adolf, brother-in-law of Alaric, to march out of Italy as they had come in. More and more the distinction between Roman and barbarian disappears. The sister of Honorius, the beautiful and learned Placidia, taken captive in Rome, marries the Gothic leader. Adolf brings the Visigoths back into the service of the empire. They pass over into Gaul and thence across the Pyrenees into Spain. Already parts of various German tribes had taken the same road and were helping themselves to the lands of the empire on both sides of the mountains. Under Wallia, the successor of Adolf, the Visigoths, serving as the allies of Rome, subdued these rival invaders and brought back the country for a time to the Roman allegiance. The price of this service was a new and final grant of land in Spain and the south of Gaul, extending from the river Loire beyond the Pyrenees and over the greater part of the peninsula. Here the wanderings of the Visigoths came to an end. They made use of what they had learned from Rome to found a great and prosperous kingdom with Toulouse as its capital. When the growth of the all-conquering Franks on the northern border reduced its Gaelic portion to a Frankish province, it was to last entire until the beginning of the 6th century, when the growth of the all-conquering Franks on the northern border reduced its Gaelic portion to a Frankish province. The Spanish portion kept up an independent life until in the early part of the 8th century. The storm of the Mohammedan invasion from the south swept it out of existence. With the Visigothic occupation, Spain and southern France were lost to Rome forever. We must now leave these pioneers of the German invasion and turn to the fortunes of some of their kinsmen who were seeking in the same way lands, wealth, and power.